There is a particular kind of moment in political history that analysts spend years waiting for, the moment when a leader who has built an entire system around controlling information sits down in front of his own officials and accidentally tells the truth. Not the whole truth, not a confession in any legal sense, but enough of it, a number here, an admission there, a careful omission that reveals more than a direct statement would, enough that anyone paying attention can see the shape of what is actually happening underneath the carefully constructed narrative of strength and stability and inevitable Russian victory that the Kremlin has been broadcasting to the world for 4 years. That moment happened on a recent morning when Vladimir Putin sat down at a meeting on economic issues and opened his mouth. He said that economic growth had been declining for 2 months in a row. He said that GDP had contracted by 1.8% between January and February. He said that manufacturing, industrial production, and construction had all suffered losses. He said it in the flat, bureaucratic tone of a man reading from a report he has been handed, in the tone of a man presenting a problem that he has just noticed and intends to address, in the tone of a man who has absolutely nothing to do with the situation he is describing and is simply the concerned leader who has arrived to fix it. He said none of this was his fault. He didn't say that last part out loud, but he didn't need to. The entire framing of the meeting said it for him. What Putin did not say was that Russia's GDP grew only 1% in 2025, after 2 consecutive years of growth that exceeded 4% and in 2024 came close to 5%. He did not say that the 1.8% contraction he was announcing was not an isolated data point, but the continuation of a trend that has been building for months. He did not say that the war he launched in February 2022 is the reason any of this is happening. He asked his economists to explain why the trajectory of macroeconomic indicators was below expectations, below not just expert forecasts but the government's own projections and those of the Central Bank of Russia. He asked them to explain it as though the explanation were a mystery, as though someone else had made the decisions that produced these numbers, as though the man asking the question were not also the answer to it. This is the story of what those numbers actually mean, what is happening inside Russia's economy right now, and why the most important thing Putin said at that meeting was not the 1.8% contraction figure but everything he chose to leave out. The 1.8% contraction that Putin announced for January and February of 2026 needs to be understood in context to grasp how serious it actually is. A GDP contraction of 1.8% sounds bad in isolation. Understood against the background of where Russia's economy was heading into those months, it is substantially worse than it sounds. Russia's GDP grew only 1% across the whole of 2025. That was already a dramatic deceleration from the 4% and nearly 5% growth of the 2 preceding years, growth that the Kremlin had pointed to as proof that Western sanctions weren't working, that Russia's war economy was thriving, that the country was adapting and strengthening under pressure. The 2025 figure punctured that argument. The January-February 2026 figure buried it. When you contract by 1.8% against a baseline year in which you only grew by 1%, you are not declining from a position of strength. You are declining from a position that was already fragile, and the decline is accelerating. Russia's central bank offered a more optimistic reading, forecasting GDP growth of 1.6% for the first quarter of 2026, a projection that would suggest the worst was already over and recovery was beginning. The Russian Academy of Sciences offered a different reading. Their forecast for the first quarter of 2026 was a year-on-year decline of 1.5%. 2 official Russian institutions, both with access to the same underlying data, producing forecasts that are not just different but pointing in opposite directions. One of them is wrong. The question worth asking is which one has a stronger institutional incentive to tell Putin what he wants to hear, and which one has a stronger institutional incentive to tell the truth. Russia's central bank reports to the Russian government. The Russian government reports to Putin. The answer to that question is not complicated. Putin's response to the contraction numbers was to do what Putin always does when confronted with evidence of his own failures, which is to find an alternative explanation that places the responsibility somewhere other than his own desk. The explanation he chose was the calendar. In January of 2026, he noted, there were 2 fewer working days than in January of 2025. In February, there was 1 fewer working day. 3 working days across 2 months, he suggested, was a contributing factor to the 1.8% GDP contraction. This is technically true in the same way that it is technically true that a man who drives his car into a river and then blames the water for the damage is not entirely wrong about the water being involved. The United Kingdom, which is not currently enjoying a period of economic prosperity by any reasonable assessment, recorded real GDP growth of 0.1% in January and 0.5% in February of 2026. The United States, Japan, and the G7 nations as a whole recorded growth in the 0.1% to 0.3% range across the same period. These countries also had calendars. Their calendars also had the same number of days removed from them. None of them contracted by 1.8%. The calendar explanation is not an explanation. It is the sound a man makes when he needs to say something and has nothing real to offer. The other bright spot Putin offered was unemployment. Russia's unemployment rate, he announced, stands at 2.1%. This is, on the surface, an impressive figure. Most developed economies would consider 2.1% unemployment to be essentially full employment, a sign of a tight labor market and strong economic conditions. Putin presented it as evidence that Russia's labor market is healthy, flexible, and developing in positive directions. What he did not present was any of the context that transforms this number from a success story into a confession. Economist Valentin Katasanov, writing for Eurasia Review in January, pointed out that the 2.1% figure does not include anyone who is not formally registered as unemployed with the Russian authorities, a significant omission in a country where the bureaucratic process of formal unemployment registration is sufficiently cumbersome that many people who have lost work simply don't bother with it. It also does not account for workers who are technically employed but are working reduced hours because their companies don't have enough work to keep them fully occupied, a category that, as we will see in a moment, has been growing rapidly across Russia's industrial sector. When these populations are included in the calculation, Katasanov estimates that Russia's real unemployment rate is approximately double the official figure. A 2.1% unemployment rate that is actually closer to 4% or 5% is not a success story. It is a statistic that has been trimmed until it fits the narrative. But even accepting Putin's 2.1% figure at face value, the number tells a story he did not intend to tell. A 2.1% unemployment rate in Russia in 2026 is not primarily evidence of economic health. It is primarily evidence of a catastrophic labor shortage. Ukraine's military has reported Russian casualties exceeding 1.31 million since the invasion began in February 2022. Even accounting for the uncertainty inherent in wartime casualty figures, the scale of Russian manpower losses is not in serious dispute. Those losses are overwhelmingly concentrated among working-age men, the demographic that forms the backbone of any industrial economy. Men who were working in factories, on construction sites, in transport and logistics and manufacturing, who are now dead, permanently disabled, or locked into military service with no clear end date. They have not returned to the Russian labor market. They will not return to the Russian labor market on any timeline that Russian economic planning can accommodate. This was a problem before the war started. The American Foreign Policy Council has noted that Russia entered Putin's invasion already facing severe demographic and labor crises, with the most optimistic scenario for stabilizing its population requiring the absorption of 550,000 migrants per year just to prevent the workforce from shrinking, and that calculation did not include the war dead. By 2024, the Russian job site Superjob was reporting that 73% of Russian companies were understaffed. The central bank governor, Elvira Nabiullina, has warned publicly that Russian businesses are being forced to raise wages to compete for workers in a labor market that simply does not have enough people in it. Those higher wages are increasing production costs. Higher production costs are producing price shocks for consumers. A labor shortage that predated the war has been dramatically accelerated by the war, and the consequence is an inflationary pressure building inside the Russian economy that higher interest rates are attempting to suppress without addressing the underlying cause. The 2.1% unemployment rate is not proof that Russia's economy is healthy. It is proof that Russia has run out of workers, and that running out of workers is now the primary threat to price stability in the country. The labor crisis is visible in what is happening to Russia's industrial sector in real time, and the numbers coming out of that sector are not the numbers of an economy adapting successfully to wartime conditions. They are the numbers of an economy beginning to come apart. Construction, which has historically been one of the most reliable indicators of domestic economic confidence and one of the most significant contributors to Russian GDP, saw output fall 16% year-on-year in January of 2026. February brought a further decline of 14%. Fixed capital investment fell 5.3% in the fourth quarter of 2025, which is the upstream cause of the construction declines, because businesses and developers who are not investing in new projects are not generating the construction activity that keeps that sector functioning. Manufacturing output across Russia fell 2.9% year-on-year during the first 2 months of 2026. Russia's cargo transport turnover, the measure of how much freight is moving through the country's logistics networks, fell to 430.3 billion ton kilometers in February, the lowest figure recorded since 2020, which was the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic and a period of global economic paralysis. Retail trade is stagnant. Wage growth, which was running at 13.5% across the whole of 2025, had slowed to 8% by February of 2026, which sounds positive until you consider that this slowdown is happening in an environment of significant inflation, meaning that real wage growth is substantially lower than the nominal figure suggests and in some sectors may already be negative. What all of these numbers describe, taken together, is not a wartime economy under pressure but managing. They describe an economy where the pressure has been sustained for long enough that the systems designed to absorb it are beginning to fail. The factory closures and production cuts that have begun appearing across Russia's industrial landscape are the most visible symptom of this failure. IZ Kartex, a mining excavator manufacturer, has put 38% of its workforce on reduced hours. In the Leningrad region alone, 8 enterprises have halted production entirely, with another 16 cutting their operational schedules. These are not marginal businesses making temporary adjustments to manage a short-term disruption. These are the kinds of decisions that companies make when they are not receiving enough orders to justify running at full capacity, when the revenue coming in does not support the costs going out, when the trajectory they are on leads toward insolvency if nothing changes, and nothing is changing. Russia's automotive sector, one of the most symbolically important components of any major industrial economy, is in visible distress. Avtovaz, Russia's largest domestic vehicle manufacturer, has halted production. Kamaz, the second largest, has moved to a 4-day workweek, repeating a move it made in the summer of 2025 as Russian vehicle sales continue to collapse. These companies were already operating in a severely constrained environment, cut off from Western technology and components by sanctions, forced to substitute domestic alternatives that are in many cases substantially inferior, competing for workers in a labor market that cannot supply them. The production halts and schedule cuts are the outcome of all of those pressures converging simultaneously. And perhaps most striking of all, Uralvagonzavod, Russia's primary tank manufacturer, the facility that produces the armored vehicles that Putin's military depends on for its ground operations in Ukraine, announced mass layoffs in November of last year that reduced staffing in some of its units by 50%. A country that is fighting a war of attrition and simultaneously laying off half the workers at its tank factory is a country where the war economy and the civilian economy are competing for the same shrinking pool of resources, and the civilian economy is losing. The consequences of all of this are landing on Russia's federal budget, with a force that the Kremlin's public statements have not fully acknowledged but that Russia's own Ministry of Finance has been forced to document. Federal budget revenues for the first quarter of 2026 were 8.2% lower than they were during the same period in 2025. The non-energy sector managed to produce 7.1% more in tax revenue, the result of value-added tax increases, higher excise taxes, and a range of other fiscal measures that Russia has imposed on its businesses to try to extract more revenue from an economy that is generating less of it. That 7.1% increase was nowhere near enough to compensate for what happened to oil and gas revenues, which were 45.4% lower in the first quarter of 2026 than they were in the first quarter of 2025. Federal expenditures, meanwhile, jumped 17% over the same period. The arithmetic produces a federal budget deficit of 4.58 trillion rubles, approximately $60 billion, at a moment when Russia is simultaneously spending hundreds of billions on prosecuting a war that it cannot afford to stop and cannot afford to continue. Energy is the load-bearing wall of Russia's economic structure. The Oxford Institute for Energy Studies has documented that taxation on oil and gas company revenues typically accounts for between 30% and 50% of Russia's federal budget revenues, with the energy sector as a whole contributing approximately 20% of GDP. When energy revenues are strong, Russia can sustain almost anything else that is going wrong. When energy revenues collapse by 45.4% in a single quarter, there is no other part of the economy large enough to absorb the gap. Russia has found a temporary reprieve in the disruption caused by military operations in the Middle East and the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, through which approximately 20% of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas flows annually. With that supply constrained, oil prices have risen to approximately $100 per barrel, and Russia has been able to sell its discounted crude at prices substantially better than it was achieving a year ago. Reuters reported in April that Russia's main oil tax revenue would double to approximately $9 billion in a single month as a result of these conditions. That is genuinely helpful to Russia's budget position in the short term. It is a bandage on a wound that requires surgery. The Russian think tank MASF, in its assessment of Russia's economic outlook, noted that even under the most optimistic scenario for oil prices, The current Middle East situation would accelerate Russia's economic growth for 2026 by approximately 0.5%, with total growth for the year not exceeding 1.3%. That optimistic scenario assumes that the disruption to Middle Eastern oil supply continues indefinitely, that no agreement between the United States and Iran reopens the Strait of Hormuz, and that oil prices remain elevated throughout the year. The moment any of those assumptions fails, Russian oil revenues fall back toward the levels that produced the 45.4% year-on-year decline in the first quarter, and the budget deficit widens again. Russia's economic situation is dependent on a geopolitical disruption it did not create, cannot control, and cannot rely on to continue. When it ends, the underlying problems will reassert themselves with the full force of 4 years of accumulated damage. Those underlying problems did not begin with the invasion of Ukraine. This is the part of the story that the debate about the war and its economic consequences tends to obscure. Vasily Burov and Andrei Yakovlev, writing in an opinion piece for the Moscow Times, put it plainly. Russia chose guns over butter long before 2022. Putin has spent years, not months, concentrating Russia's economic resources and political power among a narrow circle of regional elites, Kremlin-connected businessmen, and large enterprises with the right political relationships. The system that produces this concentration of wealth at the top was not built in response to the war. The war was built on top of a system that was already structured this way. The chronic underinvestment in social services, in infrastructure, in the kinds of public goods that create broad-based economic development rather than oligarchic accumulation, predates the invasion by years. The regional poverty that exists outside Moscow and a handful of other major cities, poverty that Putin's recruitment apparatus has been systematically exploiting to fill the ranks of his military with men who have few other economic options, is not a consequence of the war. It is the product of decades of deliberate policy choices that concentrated Russia's wealth in the hands of people who were useful to Putin and left everyone else with whatever remained. The war has accelerated these dynamics. It has made them more visible. It has stripped away some of the statistical concealment that allowed the Kremlin to present a more flattering picture of Russian economic conditions to the outside world. But the structural problems that are now producing factory closures and budget deficits and labor shortages and declining investment are not problems that a ceasefire in Ukraine would solve. They are problems that are baked into the architecture of the system Putin has built over 2 decades, a system designed to enrich a small group of people at the expense of everyone else, to maintain that small group's loyalty to Putin by ensuring their interests are inseparable from his continued rule, and to sustain that arrangement through a combination of energy revenues, political repression, and the particular kind of nationalist mythology that requires an external enemy to remain coherent. End the war and the energy revenues might eventually recover somewhat, though the sanctions infrastructure that Western governments have built will not disappear overnight, and Russia's access to Western technology and capital will remain severely constrained for years. End the war and the labor shortage does not resolve, because the men who died in Ukraine do not come back and the men who survived years of combat do not immediately return to the civilian workforce as productive economic actors. End the war and the investment drought does not reverse, because the entrepreneurs and business owners who might invest in Russia's future have spent 4 years watching the state seize assets, imprison executives for insufficient loyalty, and demonstrate that property rights in Russia are contingent on political relationships rather than legal protections. The trust that productive investment requires does not return on the day a peace agreement is signed. It returns, if it returns at all, over years and decades of demonstrated institutional reliability that Russia has not shown any capacity to provide. Putin is calling for solutions from his economists. He is asking them to explain the numbers and propose remedies, to tell him what needs to change to put Russia back on a growth trajectory. The economists in that room know the answer. Every serious analyst of Russia's economy knows the answer. The answer is that the solution to Russia's economic problems begins with removing the source of those problems, which is Vladimir Putin, his war, and the system he has spent 2 decades constructing. No economist in that room will say this, because saying it would end their career and quite possibly their freedom. So they will produce reports that identify contributing factors and recommend technical adjustments and project-optimistic scenarios that assume the best about oil prices and the worst about Western resolve, and Putin will read those reports and continue asking why the numbers aren't improving, and the numbers will continue not improving, because the question and the answer are the same person and he is the one reading the reports. Russia will not begin to show meaningful signs of economic recovery while Putin is in power. This is not a political statement or a moral judgment. It is a structural observation. The system Putin has built concentrates decision-making authority in a single person who has surrounded himself with people whose primary qualification is telling him what he wants to hear. That system is producing decisions that are accelerating Russia's economic decline and will continue producing such decisions for as long as it remains intact. The death spiral that Russia's economy has entered is not a temporary deviation from a healthy trajectory. It is the destination toward which Putin's system has always been heading, the point at which the costs of maintaining the system exceed the revenues available to sustain it, the point at which the gap between what Putin needs to keep his inner circle loyal and what Russia's economy can actually generate becomes impossible to bridge through any combination of energy revenues, statistical manipulation, and Kremlin messaging. Russia's construction sector is contracting. Its manufacturing is contracting. Its factories are moving to 3-day workweeks and laying off half their staff. Its tank manufacturer is cutting workers while a war that requires tanks continues. Its federal budget is running a $60 billion deficit while energy revenues collapse by 45%. Its labor market has run out of workers. Its businesses have stopped investing in their own future because they have no confidence in what that future looks like. Its economists are being asked to explain problems that they are not permitted to honestly diagnose. And its president is sitting at a meeting about economic issues, pointing at a calendar, and suggesting that 3 fewer working days in January and February might explain why everything is going wrong. The 1.8% GDP contraction that Putin announced is not the story. The story is what produced it, what is sustaining it, and what is coming next. The story is a system that has been consuming its own foundations for 2 decades and has now consumed enough of them that the structure is beginning to show the strain in numbers that even the Kremlin cannot fully conceal, that appear in Russia's own Ministry of Finance press releases and central bank monitoring reports and Academy of Sciences forecasts, that contradict each other in ways that reveal the pressure being applied to make them say something other than what they actually mean. The story is that the most powerful man in Russia sat down in front of his economists and accidentally told the world that his country is in serious trouble, and then asked those economists to explain why, and then listened to answers that everyone in the room knew were not the real answer, and then left the meeting having learned nothing useful and changed nothing important, because changing anything important would require changing himself, and that is the one thing Vladimir Putin has never been willing to do. The economists in that room know what needs to happen. Russia knows what needs to happen. The rest of the world watching Russia's economic statistics deteriorate month by month and quarter by quarter knows what needs to happen. The only person in Russia with the power to make it happen is the only person in Russia with every possible incentive to make sure it never does. That is not a problem with a technical solution. That is not a problem that better monetary policy or revised GDP forecasts or optimistic oil price projections will address. That is a problem that ends one way, and the timeline for that ending is the one variable that nobody, inside Russia or outside it, can calculate with any confidence. Until that ending arrives, the numbers will keep getting worse. The factories will keep cutting hours. The budget deficit will keep widening. The labor shortage will keep driving up costs. The oil revenues will keep being hostage to geopolitical situations Russia cannot control. And Putin will keep sitting at meetings, pointing at calendars, and asking his economists to explain a problem that is sitting in his chair. If you enjoyed this video, make sure that you subscribe to USA Breaking Hub.